and welcome to All Things EAP, a podcast produced by practitioners across the globe and hosted by Barleap. It provides a fun and friendly look at every aspect of EAP, helping you keep up with the latest developments and building an inclusive and equitable community around the world. Following the Barleap values, we hope to be collaborative, professional, developmental, and inclusive. Each episode will dive into an aspect of EAP with discussions, reflections, and insights from practitioners in different contexts. Whoever and wherever you are, we hope you find this podcast informative and insightful. Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things EAP. I'm Laura Richards from the University of Leeds in the UK.
And I'm Xiaoqing from Xian-Jiaotong Liverpool University. This episode is facilitated by me and Paul Breen from UCL.
Today we're diving into a question that's at the centre of so many conversations in EAP and higher education right now. Is generative AI inevitable? And more importantly, should we accept that narrative?
It's a brilliant question, Laura. And it's not just about whether we use AI or not. The panel really challenged the idea that we're somehow passive in all this. The conversation went much deeper into politics, values, and who actually gets to set agenda in our classroom and institutions.
Having listened to the discussion, I'm really keen to hear what struck you about it. But first, let me introduce our panel. We have Ayana Prevet-Goldstein from the UCL Academic Communication Centre, Mike Groves from Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and he is a returning guest on the podcast. We also have Klaus Munt from the University of Nottingham in the UK and Julia Molinari from the Open University also in the UK.
Four really distinct voices, actually. They come at this from different angles: pedagogy, policy, the ethics of technology, the history of education, but they all push back against the idea that we have no choice.
Yeah, so what kind of things came up for you as you were listening?
Well, there's a really interesting discussion about friction, the difficulty and effort involved in learning, and how AI can remove that friction with a couple of clicks. But if we remove friction, do we remove the learning?
And what about the question of truth?
Oh, that was powerful. I mean, Julia made the point that the system aren't really designed to tell the truth. Their job is to generate text that sounds plausible. That's really fundamental difference from the kinds of technologies we've adapted to in the past. And yet we are being asked to integrate them into our teaching, our assessment, and our learning outcomes without really stop to think about what that actually means.
So it's not just how do we use this tool, it's asking what we actually value in education?
Yeah, exactly. They kept coming back to that. If we center learning, if we center values like honesty and integrity and student agency, the conversations about AI looks completely different.
This feels particularly timely because we've just hosted a Barleap Professional Issues meeting here at the University of Leeds. And the topic was EAP and the Academy in the Age of GenAI. So this episode is really part of that ongoing conversation we're having as a sector about how to respond thoughtfully to these technologies.
Absolutely. And I think the panel gives us some really useful frameworks for thinking about it. They're not just saying, don't use AI. They're saying, ask harder questions first.
Exactly. And if you'd like to catch up on that PIM and other Barleap video resources, please visit the Barleap YouTube channel. Well, I think our listeners are going to find this really valuable, so let's get into it.
Hi, my name is Klaus Munt. I'm the Deputy Director for Education and Student Experience in the School of Education at the University of Nottingham.
I'm Mike Groves. I'm Senior Lecturer at the Centre for English and Additional Languages at Lingnan University in Hong Kong.
Hello, I'm Ayana Prevet-Goldstein. I'm Associate Professor and Head of the UCL Academic Communication Centre, and I also work within UCL on policy and guidance related to use of generative AI.
And hello from me, I'm Julia Molinari. I'm a lecturer in professional academic communication at the Open University's Graduate School, and I'm academic lead for generative AI at doctoral level.
Thanks, everyone. So we're just going to start quite broadly here. How far do we actually accept that generative AI is now inevitable in education? Or is that something we should even be accepting?
So I'd be very happy to start with that question. I think that the more we accept the narrative that it is inevitable, the more inevitable it becomes. It's a sort of hegemonic idea, and it comes to feel like common sense, like a given thing. It's sort of about how a cultural and ideological process connects with an economic base, with very much a private sector driven set of developments. And I do think that's what we're seeing in education. Since 2023, I've been on many cross-institutional and faculty working groups seeking to frame our approach and policy. And despite the range within those groups of informed dissent as well as critical support, generally speaking, in the outcomes from those groups, there's always an implication that uncertainty or non-use are positions to be overcome or kept in scope rather than engaged with. And I do think that it is not about all or nothing within the education sector. We could, for example, work together more than we're currently doing to set the agenda for tools used in education, to share research, to critique.
Yeah, I think the point about this is a private sector technology being sold into schools and universities is a really, really important one. And edutech is such a massive business, and it doesn't always deliver what it promises in terms of educational outcome. Where I would differ is that I would think, AI is inevitable in society, and therefore it's inevitable, I think, in education. What isn't inevitable is the ubiquity of it. I would like to see pedagogy develop where we learn to turn off the AI. And we learn when to turn it on and when not to use it as well.
I'm just going to say that I agree with that. The one point I'll disagree with you, Mike, is that actually AI isn't edutech, and it's never been designed to be edutech, I think, but it is used as such. Everything else chimes very well with me. And also, especially what you said, Ayana, the idea that as we're in education and we're constantly outward looking, our institutions are always, what does the sector do? What does that want? What does that want? And so on. And I think we need to set our own agenda somehow and remain in control of that agenda as well, because we do this for a reason, I think. So I don't think we need to or should accept the inevitability or the ubiquity of the technology. I think we should accept that it exists, but we also should find ways of using and, as you say, Mike, very importantly, deciding not to use it for our purposes.
I agree, Klaus. It is inevitable in the sense that it's there, it's real, but we can push back against that inevitability by adopting a critical stance. So you can accept the reality of things because they're beyond us, they're beyond our individual agency, sometimes they're beyond our collective agency. But we are critical beings. We're cognitively critical beings. We're reflexive beings. We do have agency. Our agency is related to the structures that we're in. It's determined to some extent, but it's not anchored inevitably to the structures. And the history of ideas and the history of knowledge and the history of social movements shows that when you do act as a collective, as Ayana was saying, we working together, you can achieve transformation and you can achieve change. And it's not about pushing one narrative over another, but it's ensuring that one narrative isn't overdetermined. There's a lot of evidence from critical scholarship in generative AI that techno-determinism and techno-fatalism are embedded by design, right? The big tech companies don't want us to be critical and push back. So why should they create systems that allow for that pushback? Which raises another big issue for me, and it's the kind of the trope of the human in the loop. You know, if we prompt it in the right way, or if we kind of choose to opt out, then that's all fine. But I suppose I would push back against that as well, because the technology is not designed for us to push back. It's convenient for the big tech companies to feel that the responsibility is on us to make decisions. And actually, that's a bit of a myth, because how are you supposed to make decisions if you don't know what you're prompting? And that's the whole point why you're prompting these things, because you don't know stuff. So how can you critique what comes out of it?
You make a very interesting and very important point there, and that is that technology in general, I would say, and this particular technology especially, is designed to keep you engaged with it and disengage with other things. Hence the ubiquity of summaries, which don't actually want you to read for 3 hours, that kind of thing. And that's been a phenomenon for a long time that has nothing to do with AI. But I would say it seems a bit too simple to point at the big tech companies. While of course they do this by design, I would agree to that. But if we talk about agency, that it is also on me, the user or the non-user, to say, I want to use this for a purpose, or I do not want to do that. So I wouldn't remove that agency and that responsibility from each individual, because then we're basically doing the same thing somehow. We're kind of taking the responsibility away from everyone.
I agree wholeheartedly with so much of what Julia said and Klaus's response also. But I do think that we have to consider how much are we empowering students to make those decisions? How much understanding do they have? It's an awful lot of responsibility to put on a student, especially if we're setting up a structure which I suppose pushes them towards potentially choosing to use these tools, making them feel that they're missing out if they're not using them, making them feel like they're disadvantaged, or setting assessments which presuppose use of these tools. I think it's our responsibility as well as educators and as an institution to move away from a sort of instrumentalist approach. How do you use these tools? Not that that's not important in certain contexts, to thinking about students to make those decisions that you're talking about, Klaus, I suppose, making sure that they understand how the tech works before they think about how to use it, I suppose, and what the impact of using those tools are.
I think it's an interesting point. And the thing that I keep coming back to is thinking about friction, because this is a relative, and I haven't heard this term in terms of education until quite recently, but this idea of effort and difficulty being key to learning, and the way that AI just can take away that friction. You can create an essay that would have taken a day or 2 days, and you can, on the surface at least, produce it with a couple of clicks. If my undergraduate years are anything to go by, I wasn't a very good undergraduate student, I'll admit it now. I didn't really see the point of a lot of the stuff that I was writing. I wasn't engaged with a lot of stuff that I was doing. So if AI had been available, I would probably have used it in a way that minimized friction for me getting through the course and therefore minimized my learning. Instead, I used other ways to minimize the friction and minimize the learning that I'm not going to go into now.
I completely agree with that. I like that metaphor of friction. And I guess what it raises for me is the bigger question of what must the world be like, or what must education be like for that friction to not be okay, for us to not sit with the trouble, as Sarah Ahmed might say. And to add to the frictions that you've mentioned, I would add other frictions such as getting rid of imperfection, getting rid of bumpy, unsmooth reads, to sort of refer to Joan Turner's work on the smooth read, the kind of ideological assumption that is actually the aim of writing, for example. So I think the bigger question is, what must it be like for that to be a problem, for all these frictions to be a problem? Klaus, I completely know that all these things have been happening forever, and these issues have come up again and again, way before any of the generative AI, summarizing, Turnitin, all the rest of it, essay mill, it's all been done before. We've been there before. But I think what these social technologies do is they constantly flag up the big question of what world do we want to live in? What are the values that we are subscribing to? And I think what generative AI is doing, and it is to do with big tech, because it was never an educational imperative to do this. It was imposed from the top down. And now we're all struggling to define education in terms of what the machines are telling us education is. So yes, it has all been there, but I think the sort of human propensity to constantly critique is there, and I think we should never, ever stop questioning it.
If I may go really old school now for a second, I mean, this idea of friction, difficulty in learning, I can trace that easily back to ancient Confucianism, right? The idea that learning is difficult, achievement is difficult, self-improvement, if you like. And I'm not talking about perfection here. The perfection narrative is linked to the deficit model. I don't care about a typo, really. But the whole idea of difficulty in learning, it is a recurring theme, and I think it is a recurring theme for a reason. We learn with challenges. We remove the challenge, we don't learn. So, as you said, Mike, you remove the friction, and there's nothing, or there's very little.
And the other thing that's gone back to the beginning of human civilization is technological change. And I can remember teaching in the 90s, and we got an overhead projector. And people were talking about using the overhead projector as a learning technology. I can remember when students would copy and paste from Wikipedia and not take all the hyperlinks out. We adapted, we adopted, we changed parts of our praxis, and we got better at it. I do think there's a question of why is it suddenly education pedagogy has evolved and developed with technology. I don't think it is. I just think because we're in the eye of the storm. Now, I'm not saying it's not important, it's not difficult, but I'm also suggesting that we've been here before.
I couldn't agree more. I think perhaps what's different this time is that whereas many of the developments over the last decades have impacted primarily on students with English as an additional language in that particular community in terms of thinking about the impact of sort of machine translation, for example, or synthesis and summary. What we're seeing now is that this is impacting on the whole student population. And I think so there's a different level of awareness within institutions right at the top that actions need to be taken and that changes need to be made to assessment forms, for example, in a way that we never even had a policy for machine translation at our institution. And we never had all these working groups to try and address this, even though it was radical and fundamental in the way it was changing.
Yeah, I just want to come back to looking at education through the lens of friction and going back to something Klaus said about Confucianism. I would, again, push back against that characterization of education because there's a lot of educational theory that emphasizes fun and creativity and collaboration. It doesn't have to be an individual struggle. We can work collaboratively. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about education because arguably, the AI can be fun, it can be creative. There are all kinds of opportunities there to achieve that. I mean, even the friction bit, you could design tasks that challenge a user to really think about what they're prompting, asking the probing questions, why have you given me this response? So there's lots of ways you can critically prompt and make and create that friction. But I suppose going back to what you were saying, Mike, that we've been here before. I think I agree with Ayana. Although we have been before, there is something quite significant about where we are now. I think there is a lot to be said to the fact that these technologies are not committed to the truth. Like they may come up with truthful claims because the statistical probability of how they work allows for, truthful things to be said. But I think the fact that this kind of Trojan horse, as I see it, that's come into our educational system, is that truth is no longer a virtue. It's no longer considered worthwhile. And we know the complicated philosophical history of truth, but it's actually impacting on people's lives. And I think the machines do what Helen Beathan explains so well in her chapter in a recent publication called Critical Perspectives on Academic Writing. Is Helen uses this metaphor of parsing, that the idea that writing can pass as human or writing can pass as truthful without being truthful, without being committed to the truth. So I think that is quite insidious. And I think it possibly set today's conversation a little bit apart from previous discussions about threats to education.
I think that goes back to what our role is. And I mean, our role as education, as educators. If we are aware of what the technology does and how it operates, and yes, some of the benefits, definitely the risks, then I would say we are actually in a fairly good position to work with that, or rather work against it if we want to. The idea of, truth is no longer of value. Is this not actually a challenge that we need to take on actively? And that relates to what I actually said. I didn't say education needs to be hard. I said we need a challenge to learn. I'm concerned about the removal of the challenge. I think we need constructive challenges, and then we can grow and we can learn new things. And we are at a point now where we, you, me, all of us are kind of faced with a really new and challenging situation. So one thing that we can do perhaps is that we can take this into the classroom and address it with our learners and with our colleagues. And because, let's not pretend that everybody has a thorough understanding of the technology. And in that sense, it's actually an opportunity to make a very risky situation perhaps into something that could actually become constructive, I hope.
Yeah, and the point of truth, again, sorry to sound like a broken record, but we've been here before. I can remember people saying, you can't use Wikipedia. Why not? Because you can't trust it. It's not the truth. When the internet first came out or expanded in a big way, people were saying there was a big thing about you can't believe what you read online. So if we are aware that what we are learning or what ChatGPT is telling us, I'm very conscious of the verbs I'm using, but what ChatGPT is suggesting to be the truth is not reliable. If we know that, then we know to fact check. And I don't think that undermines a notion of truth.
I think Wikipedia was never designed with the intention to not be truthful because it is an open system. The AI technology is not designed to be truthful. Truth doesn't come into it, basically, because it is a probabilistic system. And I think this brings me to another point that I think is connected to all of this, and which is also connected to something you said, Klaus, about the onus is on us as educators to help students understand this. Now, again, saying that sounds all very reasonable, but what that hides beneath its reasonable surface is that do we even know what these systems are? What gives us the confidence to feel that we can educate? And I think the language that's used to talk about AI, the very phrase artificial intelligence, is incredibly misleading. The whole kind of words that are used to refer to it are misleading because they don't actually capture what this technology is. Now, one of the acronyms that I've started to use is the SALAMI acronym, which basically stands for Systemic Approaches to Learning Algorithms with Machine Inference. So calling it artificial intelligence gives the impression that it is coming up with intelligent content. It gives the impression that intelligence is one thing, that there is only one metric for measuring intelligence, and that it can therefore be artificial, a bit like an artificial heart. Now, a heart has a very specific function. There's input and output, and that's basically how it works. And that's why artificial heart can be artificial hearts. But artificial intelligence is not the same as a heart. And I think we have a problem with language, and we have a problem with what that language is signifying and how that positions us in relation to the technology.
I think we've certainly got a problem with language. And as I said earlier, you hear people talking about the AI knows or the AI understands. And I think we all would all agree that it is probabilistic. It doesn't have knowledge in the same way that we have knowledge as people.
I think this comes back to the discussion we were having right at the beginning about these tools not being designed specifically for learning, and that they shouldn't be leading the narrative on education. While we may not have the greatest level of understanding to be able to discuss these things fully with our students, what we do have an understanding on is the learning process and what we're teaching our students. And that should be what we're centering, not these tools. Being able to discuss with students what we hope to share, what we hope they learn, why we are teaching what we're teaching, why we're assessing in the way we're assessing, is a part to me of helping them understand whether it's worth outsourcing or sitting with the trouble. because that's the key purpose, really, in that particular teaching. And that may or may not then, therefore, include generative AI. It may include discussion about how that might diminish learning. It may include discussion about the reasons why students might make individual personal choices for ethical reasons to not use these tools, or why they may feel for other reasons that it supports them in their learning. But the starting point is the learning, not these tools. And I think we need to recognize that that's where our expertise lies.
Yeah, there are lots of scholars even at the moment that would absolutely argue that, and the way that I think that they would put it would be in terms of centering values rather than the technology. So the value of honesty, the value of truth, the value of transparency, the value of collegiality, the value of knowledge. And once you flip the framing, like you stop focusing on the technology and all of its eugenic implications, it's all in the literatures on generative AI. They don't have to be my values as a teacher, but they are values. And basically, we all have values, whichever side of the debate we fall on. We are all motivated and we see the world through the values that we have, whether it's objectivity, whether it's neutrality, whether it's partisan politics, whatever that is. But by centering those values or foregrounding them, at least that gives everyone a kind of equal terrain around which to discuss. And then that's where the criticality can come in. And then choices can be maybe more within our reach.
Just a point that I hope fits, since you said values a lot. I think there is a systemic issue, as in the education system or the societal system even. When I hear people talk about education, higher education, why would I get a degree and all that? All of this comes down to something countable. It comes down to how much money will I make? It comes down to employability figures. If you put a number on it, it doesn't matter. I think that has lost sight of the core mission of education in general. We all need to pay the rent and all that. But I think the actual mission of education is, or should be, or has been at least, or was, to form responsible, growing individuals, citizens, and not how much money will I make in the end. Now, if we have a technology and how quickly can I get there? Yeah, we're in a time where we're talking about reduced degrees, short 2-year bachelor's degrees and all that. So everything has to be faster, more, and so on. And I think the technology feeds right into that. Any technology, actually, not only AI. And this is, to me, a systemic problem where what we are saying now and what the institutions sometimes value or society values may actually not align very well. So that just compounds the issue.
And I think it also kind of obscures the fact that not everybody is motivated by money. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but if I was motivated by money, I could have gone into the finance sector if I wanted to make money. But no, I've ended up in education where I'm not making money and I'm working overtime. But there is a sense that this narrative that we only do things because of financial motivation is actually wrong. It's not evidence-based.
A closing question to draw all of this together. So one of the issues that's really emerged from this is the idea that historically, somehow, in the face of all these different advances in technology, even things like gamification, 15, 20 years ago, were going to be the new thing. We've always managed to absorb these systems into our practice as educators. Can we do this with generative AI? Or is this something like I read recently? Someone said that this is the equivalent of the tide of change that came when King Henry dissolved the monasteries. Are we really heading towards that point?
I know this is going to sound a little bit sort of nerdy bloke who lives by himself, but I've been playing with some vibe coding recently, and it's so easy to set up a website now that can play a game with a student or can give feedback to a student or focus on a certain language point. So there's ways of doing things that really can build on our pedagogy and do things in a way that we could have done before if we paid a web designer. But there's so much potential for increasing and improving and enhancing what we do.
I think there is that. And if we only focus on all the things we said about truth, all the things we said about reliability and so on and so forth, then we're actually missing a part of the discussion. I think that is important to bear in mind. What are then the opportunities of how this could actually make a positive difference? And I'm not talking about this, as you put it, Julia, in technical terms as a generator. I'm talking about actually creating something that helps people learn. And that is possible as well. It is not only about spitting out text and more text. It is about things that I'm doing something similar. And I'm also kind of trying to control the technology a little bit through work with AI agents that you can set up quite easily. And it gives you a little bit of influence on how they operate and what they do. And if we manage to go into that direction as well as taking a critical stance to all of this, then we may come out with something that is actually helpful for our students and for our practice, something that we couldn't do before.
Yeah, I suppose my concern is that this kind of over-determining the kind of optimism around it can downplay the real harms that are coming out of it. I mean, there are real harms in terms of how these machines are trained, the kind of slave labor that they rely on that is invisible, and the kind of post-traumatic stress that's created, that's endured by people, non-Western countries that are being paid a pittance to remove content that is harmful. I think there's a huge environmental impact that is really, really serious and is unregulated because these big tech companies are not paying their taxes. They're not declaring how much energy is actually being used. The AI is being used for warfare. So there is a really, really big ethical elephant in the room. And whilst I agree, there are always affordances to everything, opportunities and challenges. There's always an argument to say, well, it could work. Cars, the technology of cars, we know they pollute, we know they damage the environment, but we also know that they are very handy. So yes, of course, but I think not enough is discussed at the level of the sort of individual interactions that we have with these machines. That not enough is said about why this technology exists in the way it does and the harm that it does.
I mean, the technology exists like any technology because it can. You're right about the environmental impacts. You're right about some of the social impacts. You're right about nobody likes war, but warfare has always been a technological competition more than most other forms of human endeavor. However, refusing to engage with it at an educational level is going to solve none of those problems. If we engage with it and embed into our education the ethics, the environmental aspects of it, the problems and everything else, and we deal with it as part of our world that has come in it recently through whatever ideological lens we want. You can deal with it as a marvelous capitalist innovation, creative destruction, all of that kind of stuff. You can deal with it as an environmental threat, whatever. But if we deal with it and communicate and encourage our students to think about it in a sensible, measured and evidence-based way, that I believe is the way that we will help our students, because it's going to be their world. No, it's not going to be our world for much longer. Thrive in an AI, shall I say, AI ubiquitous world.
Yeah, I think I'd go back to something I said at the beginning. If the whole system is set up to achieve quick wins, quick fixes, easy, smooth rides, efficiency is people go to university to get a degree, not to learn. If everything you've said is set within a context that, in a sense, is not conducive to thinking about it in this nuanced and critical way, there is hope and there is possibility in thinking that actually, no, we can think about all of this afresh. We can break down systems and we can reimagine the future that we would like to inhabit.
Okay, I've just
Jump in with one last thing, really going back to what Klaus was saying about numbers and the issue around an education being to earn more and how we've lost in some respects because a degree has become much more of a usual thing. There's a much larger number of people taking first degrees, the value of a degree as being this sort of specialist, privileged, elitist credit that would for certain get you a jump at some point so you could enjoy and focus on the learning. That has shifted and we've become much more of a student as consumer. I think we haven't talked about that enough today, and I know we're running out of time, but I think that's a huge impact on this idea of valuing the product, the end result over the process. And that's got to be the context in which we understand use of or overuse of generative AI. So to me, it's about recognizing that some things have changed in terms of higher education and its socio-political economic context, but that there are also very many good outcomes of that in that we have more people accessing higher education. To put it down to sort of massification in a negative sense is problematic in and of itself. So we need to then think about how do we bring back the process and the learning. And to me, that's, again, it's starting about from centering the learning and including all of the areas that Julia has talked about. And actually, I think a lot of the ways in which we set up that learning impact on how students engage with generative AI. And it's not about just what we do as individual educators. It's about us pushing and pushing and pushing on the system in which we work to value that process. So basic things like making sure that students actually have time to engage with assessments properly, to put themselves into it and for us to mark them properly and to value students bringing themselves to that assessment. Impact on how students engage with generative AI and how they engage with their learning process. It's not really about generative AI, is it? It's about all of those things about education that have always been the case, but they've become ever so much more important now, I think. And that's the work for us to do. Yes, in our own practice with our students, but also in pushing systemically.
Okay, thank you everyone. I think that's going to bring this episode towards the end.
And now, before we wrap up today, thank you so much for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and found it useful. As an added bonus, if today's discussion has sparked your interest, many of the themes we have explored are examined in greater depth in the recently published book, Critical Perspectives on Academic Writing, the Politics and Practices of Writing Development in UK Higher Education, edited by Ayana, one of our guests today, along with David Mallows, and published by UCL Press. It brings together a range of perspectives on academic writing, including some of the challenges and opportunities presented by generative AI in higher education. And it's certainly worth accessing if you want more information on some of the themes that we've discussed today. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
We really want to hear from you as well. So if you'd like to share a comment, suggestion, or an insight into something that we've talked about on one of the episodes, please send us an email or voice note at podcast@barleap.org. But you can also get in touch through our YouTube channel at All Things EAP. Thank you again for listening, and we hope that you can join us for the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye.